The largest earthquake ever recorded by humans did not come from the deepest trench on Earth. It came from a trench most people have never heard of, sitting quietly off the coast of South America and stretching roughly 5,900 kilometers, nearly 3,666 miles, along the edge of the Pacific. The Mariana Trench is deeper. It reaches roughly 11 kilometers, close to 36,000 feet below the surface, and holds the record everyone knows. The Peru-Chile Trench is shallower. It is also the place where the ocean has demonstrated just how much energy the Earth can release. On May 22nd, 1960, this trench produced an earthquake so powerful that its energy dwarfed almost everything that came before it. The rupture lasted around 10 minutes, and the resulting waves crossed the Pacific. 22 hours later, they reached Japan, more than 17,000 kilometers, around 10,600 miles away. People died on the other side of the ocean from an earthquake that had begun beneath the floor of the South Pacific. And the earthquake itself is not the part scientists find most unsettling. Sections of this trench are locked right now. The plates beneath the Pacific are still moving, stress is still accumulating, and another major rupture is expected. Scientists know the energy is building, they simply cannot say when it will be released. There is another reason this trench remains so poorly understood. Until January 2022, no human being had ever reached its deepest floor. When scientists finally got there, they found an ecosystem operating under pressures that should make large predators extraordinarily difficult to sustain. And this is not a small feature. The trench stretches thousands of kilometers along the coast of South America, while less than a fraction of its total length has ever been directly observed. Every expedition has the potential to reveal something that has never been seen before. Even the life found there is beginning to challenge what scientists thought they understood about the deep ocean. In 2023, researchers described an entirely new genus of predatory creature living at depths approaching 8,000 meters, roughly 26,000 feet. The same geological system responsible for the trench's earthquakes is also shaping the Andes, influencing the climate of the Atacama Desert, and supporting one of the most productive fisheries on Earth. The Mariana is famous because it is deep. The Peru-Chile Trench is something different. Depth tells you how far down the ocean goes. It does not tell you what the Earth can do there. In this video, we're going beneath the Peru-Chile Trench to follow the earthquakes, the strange life, and the geological forces building beneath the Pacific, and to understand why the most dangerous trench in the ocean may not be the deepest one. Now let's descend into the trench that keeps moving beneath the Pacific. Along the western edge of South America, the seafloor follows a boundary that is almost continental in scale. The Peru-Chile Trench, also known as the Atacama Trench, extends from Ecuador towards southern Chile for about 5,900 kilometers, roughly 3,666 miles. It traces the coastline for thousands of miles, but its true significance lies beneath that narrow depression, where one portion of Earth is continually being drawn into another. At its deepest measured point, Richards Deep, the trench descends to about 8,066 meters, roughly 26,460 feet, off northern Chile near Antofagasta. Yet the depth itself is only the visible expression of a much larger mechanism. This is not simply a canyon carved into the ocean floor, nor a fracture left behind by some ancient disturbance. It is a subduction trench, formed where an oceanic tectonic plate bends downward and passes beneath a continental plate. The plate arriving here is the Nazca Plate. Beneath the immense weight of the Pacific, it moves eastward and meets the South American Plate along a boundary extending for thousands of kilometers. Rather than stopping at the continent, the denser oceanic crust bends, sinks, and begins its descent toward the mantle, carrying seawater, sediments, minerals, and fragments of ocean floor into the deep interior of Earth. That movement is remarkably fast by geological standards. The Nazca Plate converges with South America at up to about 8 centimeters per year, roughly 3 inches, along parts of the boundary. Over a human lifetime of 80 years, that amounts to nearly 6.5 meters, about 21 feet, of movement. A distance small enough to disappear beneath an ordinary step becomes something much larger when multiplied across an entire plate and sustained for centuries. The important detail is not simply that the plates meet, but how they meet. At the Mariana Trench, one oceanic plate descends beneath another oceanic plate in the open Pacific, far from the direct collision between ocean and continent. Here, the descending Nazca Plate meets the enormous South American continental mass. The result is a boundary capable of transmitting immense forces into the continent itself. As the Nazca Plate sinks, the edge of South America is compressed and lifted. Rock is folded, fractured, thickened, and pushed upward over geological time. The Andes are part of this same long interaction, rising as the oceanic plate continues its descent beneath the continent. The trench therefore marks more than a line on the seafloor. It is the surface trace of a planetary scale conveyor, one side descending while the other side deforms above it. At intervals, friction prevents the plates from moving smoothly. Elsewhere, movement continues through smaller slips and gradual deformation. Across the entire boundary, the geometry remains active, with the ocean floor being consumed and the continent being reshaped. The scale becomes clearer when the boundary is imagined not as a single feature, but as a continuous contact zone beneath an entire coastline. Every small increment of convergence adds another fraction of strain to that system. The motion is almost imperceptible from one year to the next, yet the accumulated displacement becomes enormous across geological time. This is what gives the Peru-Chile Trench its unusual character. Its depth is only the outermost measurement. Beneath it lies a moving interface between ocean and continent, extending for thousands of kilometers and linking the deep Pacific directly to the architecture of an entire continent. The depression seen from above is merely the place where that immense process becomes visible. At 3:11 in the afternoon on May 22nd, 1960, the ground beneath southern Chile began moving with a force that would redraw the boundary between land and sea. In Valdivia, the shaking continued for approximately 10 minutes, long enough for ordinary measures of time to lose their meaning. The earthquake reached a magnitude of 9.5, making it the largest earthquake ever recorded by modern instruments. Its rupture extended for about 1,000 kilometers, roughly 620 miles, along the boundary where the Nazca Plate had been pressing against South America. The number itself is almost impossible to picture, so the landscape became the measuring instrument. Near Valdivia, the ground sank by as much as 2 meters, about 6.5 feet, in places. Coastlines that had existed above the water were lowered permanently. Rivers changed their courses. Areas that had been dry became tidal. Maps drawn before the earthquake were suddenly describing a coastline that no longer existed. Beneath all of this was an immense release of accumulated strain. The earthquake's seismic energy was extraordinary, even among the rarest events known to science. Estimates place the energy released by this single earthquake at roughly 26% of the energy released by all other earthquakes around the world during the remainder of the 20th century. A single rupture had briefly become a geological event on a planetary scale. The movement was not confined to one point beneath Valdivia. The fault had ruptured across a vast section of the plate boundary, allowing enormous blocks of the seafloor and continental margin to shift relative to one another. Some areas rose, while others descended, changing elevations across hundreds of kilometers. The Earth had not simply shaken, it had adjusted its shape. In the communities along southern Chile, the consequences accumulated through the long duration of the event and the changes it left behind. Estimates of deaths associated with the earthquake and tsunami vary widely, from several hundred to several thousand, reflecting the difficulty of reconstructing a disaster that affected such a broad region. Thousands more were injured, and nearly 2 million people were left homeless. Tens of thousands of homes were destroyed or rendered unusable, yet the most enduring changes were not all visible in the first minutes. In the weeks that followed, landslides altered valleys and lakes, while the coastline remained permanently transformed. Even the navigational charts used by ships had to be reconsidered because familiar depths and shorelines had shifted beneath them. For those who study the event today, the remarkable part is not simply that the earthquake reached a magnitude rarely approached in Earth's recorded history. It is that so much of the boundary moved together. The rupture connected distant sections of the fault into one immense episode, turning years of accumulated strain into minutes of motion. And beneath the Pacific, that movement also displaced the seafloor itself. Water resting above the changing seabed could not remain unaffected. The earthquake had begun beneath the land and ocean boundary, but its influence was already extending beyond the fault, carried outward through the entire body of the Pacific. The first movement was followed by aftershocks, some powerful enough to deepen the disruption across an already altered landscape. In the hours that followed, people were still dealing with damaged roads, broken bridges, flooded lowlands, and unstable ground, while the Pacific was carrying the disturbance far beyond the Chilean coast. What had started as movement along a buried boundary was becoming a change in the behavior of the ocean itself. The boundary had moved, and the water was following. The ocean did not receive the earthquake as a distant echo. It received it as movement across the entire breadth of the Pacific. When the Valdivia earthquake shifted the seafloor, enormous sections of the ocean floor rose and fell with it. Water above those displaced surfaces was pushed upward, then outward, creating a tsunami whose energy traveled through the Pacific basin in expanding waves. Unlike ordinary wind waves, whose motion is concentrated near the surface, a tsunami involves the movement of water through the full depth of the ocean. In deep water, the wave can cross great distances with little visible height while carrying immense energy. Along the coast of Chile, that energy arrived within minutes. Waves reached about 25 meters, roughly 82 feet, in some locations, sweeping across low-lying settlements and carrying debris far inland. Harbors were damaged, boats were lifted from their moorings, and coastal communities were struck by water arriving in repeated surges. The first wave was not necessarily the largest, and the ocean continued moving long after the initial shaking had ended. Water returned and advanced again, turning the shoreline into a place of repeated change for many hours. Farther across the Pacific, the wave became a measure of how connected distant coastlines truly were. About 15 hours after the earthquake, roughly 24,000 kilometers, about 15,000 miles, from southern Chile, the tsunami reached Hilo on the island of Hawaii. Waves there rose to approximately 11 meters, about 36 feet, entering the city and destroying much of its waterfront. 61 people died in Hilo, and the devastation was so extensive that parts of the city center were later redesigned to reduce exposure to future waves. The distance had changed, but the geological event had not. The same disturbance that had altered shorelines in Chile was still moving across the ocean, its energy spreading through deep water toward islands and continents that had no connection to the earthquake itself. About 22 hours after the rupture began, the waves reached Japan, more than 17,000 kilometers, roughly 10,600 miles, from the source. Along parts of the coast, tsunami waves reached approximately 5.5 meters, about 18 feet. 138 people died. Fishing villages and coastal infrastructure were damaged by water that had traveled across an entire ocean basin from a rupture that had begun nearly a day earlier. Other Pacific coastlines also recorded the passage of the tsunami. The Philippines, New Zealand, and the Aleutian Islands experienced significant wave activity, extending the reach of the event across an enormous geographic area. The Pacific had acted as a single connected body, allowing one movement of the seafloor to become a sequence of consequences thousands of kilometers away. The significance of the event extended beyond the destruction itself. Before 1960, there was no coordinated warning network capable of rapidly communicating tsunami danger across the Pacific. The Valdivia earthquake demonstrated that an earthquake occurring beside one coastline could threaten communities on another continent many hours later. In the aftermath, scientists and governments expanded cooperation that became the Pacific Tsunami Warning System. Seismic observations, tide gauges, ocean measurements, and communication networks were brought together so that information about a distant earthquake could reach vulnerable coastlines before the waves arrived. The system grew from a simple lesson written across the Pacific in moving water. Distance does not disconnect an ocean from its source. A rupture beneath one margin can become a signal carried through the deepest parts of the sea, reaching shores that may have felt nothing when the earth first moved beneath Chile. The earthquake record along this boundary reads less like a sequence of isolated disasters and more like a record of recurring movement. Long before the Great Rupture of 1960, the same margin of South America had already produced earthquakes of extraordinary size, leaving behind evidence that the forces beneath the Pacific coast were capable of repeating themselves across generations. In 1868, a great earthquake struck near Arica, with modern estimates placing its magnitude between 8.8 and 9.1. In 1906, another major rupture affected Ecuador and Colombia, reaching approximately magnitude 8.8. 16 years later, the Atacama region experienced another event, estimated at magnitude 8.5. The pattern continued through the 20th and early 21st centuries, with major earthquakes striking near Valparaiso, southern Peru, northern Peru, Mal, Iquique, and Illapel. In 1985, the Valparaiso earthquake reached magnitude 8.0. Southern Peru followed in 2001 with an earthquake of magnitude 8.4. Northern Peru experienced another magnitude 8.0 event in 2007. Then came Mal in 2010, reaching magnitude 8.8, followed by Iquique at magnitude 8.2 in 2014, and Illapel at magnitude 8.3 in 2015. Each event released only a portion of the strain stored along the boundary. That distinction matters. A large earthquake does not necessarily empty an entire subduction zone of accumulated energy. Rupture may travel through one section while neighboring sections remain locked, continuing to deform as the plates converge. The geological process therefore persists after the shaking has passed, with different portions of the boundary moving through different stages of the same long cycle. The Mall earthquake offers one of the clearest examples. At 3:34 in the morning on February 27th, 2010, the rupture reached magnitude 8.8, making it one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded. Much of central Chile was asleep when the ground began moving. The earthquake generated a tsunami that reached nearby coastal areas within minutes, while the broader Pacific carried its energy far beyond the immediate region. 4 years later, the Iquique earthquake reached magnitude 8.2. The following year, the Illapel earthquake reached magnitude 8.3. Both events prompted tsunami warnings across the Pacific, extending the reach of the geological boundary beyond the coastline where the rupture began. What emerges from this history is not a simple progression toward larger earthquakes. It is something more persistent. Great ruptures appear, sections of the boundary recover, neighboring areas continue accumulating strain, and eventually another portion gives way. The process has no obvious endpoint because the movement of the Nazca Plate beneath South America continues regardless of what happens above it. For seismologists, the historical record is valuable precisely because it reveals repetition. Detailed measurements of recent earthquakes combine with older geological evidence to extend the record farther into the past. Together, they show that exceptional earthquakes are part of the natural behavior of this boundary rather than departures from it. The events already observed also do not define an absolute upper limit. The size of a future earthquake depends on how much of the fault ruptures together, how strongly those sections are locked, and how strain has accumulated between major events. Along a boundary this extensive, those conditions can vary greatly from one region to another. The history, therefore, remains open, not because the geological process is uncertain, but because its next arrangement of rupturing segments cannot yet be known. A fault can hold its shape for years, while the forces acting through it continue to grow. Along the Peru-Chile boundary, that difference between movement and restraint is written into the structure of the seafloor itself. Some portions of the plate boundary creep gradually, allowing part of the accumulated strain to escape through small movements. Other sections behave differently. Friction keeps the plates from sliding freely, even though the Nazca Plate continues pressing beneath South America. The rock around the boundary responds by bending and deforming, storing elastic energy as it is forced away from its preferred position. The longer that locked condition persists, and the greater the area held in place, the more energy can become available when movement finally resumes. This process is not invisible to science. On land, networks of global positioning system receivers track the movement of the South American continent with extraordinary precision. A station may shift only a few millimeters, less than 1/4 of an inch, yet repeated measurements collected over years can reveal whether sections of the continent are being pulled toward the ocean, compressed, or gradually released. Farther offshore, geodetic instruments placed on the seafloor provide another layer of information. These devices measure changes that cannot be captured fully from land, allowing researchers to compare movement across different parts of the boundary. The resulting patterns help distinguish areas that are creeping from those where strain remains trapped. Off Peru, the geometry becomes especially intricate. In the northern portion of the subduction zone, the descending Nazca Plate follows a relatively shallow path beneath the continent, creating what geologists call a flat slab section. Instead of descending steeply soon after reaching the trench, the plate travels beneath the continent at a much lower angle before sinking deeper into Earth. This geometry can bring the plate interface beneath a much broader portion of the continent, changing where strain accumulates and how earthquakes may develop. Farther south, the Arica and Iquique regions contain sections known as seismic gaps. These are not empty spaces in the fault. They are portions of the boundary where large earthquakes have not ruptured the full segment for long periods, leaving scientists to examine how much strain may have accumulated since earlier events. Historical earthquakes provide one reference, while modern measurements provide another. Together, they reveal patches where the interface remains strongly coupled, meaning the two plates are moving toward one another while resisting direct sliding. The southern Peru segment carries another important estimate. Models based on observed plate motion, fault geometry, and measured coupling place its potential earthquake range around magnitude 8.4 to magnitude 9.0. This does not describe a scheduled event, nor does it predict that the entire range will rupture together. It describes the physical capacity implied by the portion of the boundary that appears capable of storing strain. That distinction gives the locked fault its peculiar character. Nothing dramatic has to happen at the surface for the system to change. Every year, the Nazca Plate advances by centimeters. The continent responds by deforming. Some of that motion is released gradually, while some remains stored along the locked interface. The instruments on land and beneath the ocean are therefore recording something that cannot be seen directly with the human eye. They are tracing the gradual deformation of a continent as it responds to a boundary that continues accumulating strain beneath the Pacific. Each measurement is small on its own, almost too slight to notice, yet the sequence becomes meaningful when thousands of observations are placed together across years. The pattern reveals where the crust is yielding and where it remains held in place. A model can be precise, carefully calibrated, and still be smaller than the Earth it is trying to describe. The history of major subduction earthquakes has shown this more than once, each time revealing a boundary capable of behaving beyond the limits scientists had assigned to it. Before 2004, the Sumatra-Andaman subduction zone was not generally regarded as capable of producing an earthquake beyond magnitude 9. On December 26th of that year, a rupture extending for about 1,300 kilometers, roughly 800 miles, reached magnitude 9.1. The tsunami that followed spread across the Indian Ocean and contributed to approximately 227,000 deaths. The event did not merely add another entry to an earthquake catalog, it exposed a limitation in the way the boundary had been understood. A similar revision came from Japan. Before 2011, official assessments for the Tohoku region placed the probable maximum magnitude near 8.2. On March 11th, the earthquake reached magnitude 9.0. The difference was not a small adjustment. Because earthquake energy increases enormously with magnitude, the larger event represented roughly 60 times more energy than an 8.2 earthquake. The tsunami then traveled across the northeastern coast of Japan, overwhelming defenses that had been designed around smaller assumptions. Japan had spent decades studying its subduction zones, building dense networks of seismometers, positioning instruments across the seafloor, and collecting generations of geological evidence. Its warning systems and coastal defenses represented some of the most advanced preparations on Earth. Yet the Tohoku earthquake demonstrated that sophisticated observation does not guarantee a complete understanding of how a fault can rupture. That history matters along the Peru-Chile Trench because the boundary is not a short, isolated structure. Its active margin extends for about 5,900 kilometers, roughly 3,666 miles, and its geological record contains repeated great earthquakes. Measurements now reveal where portions of the interface remain strongly coupled, while models estimate how strain is distributed beneath the continent. The information is substantial, but it does not remove the possibility that some important part of the system remains outside the present picture. There is also a difference in where the instruments can observe the process. Much of the monitoring along the Peru-Chile margin comes from stations on land, where researchers can measure how the continent deforms as the plate beneath it continues to move. Direct measurements at the plate interface require instruments on the seafloor, positioned much closer to the boundary itself. Those observations are more difficult to obtain and maintain, leaving portions of the fault less directly observed than heavily instrumented regions of Japan. The result is an unusual scientific position. The accumulated strain is not an idea drawn from imagination. It can be measured through changes in position, patterns of coupling, earthquake sequences, and geological records. Locked sections can be identified, potential rupture zones can be mapped. Yet the precise behavior of those sections during a great earthquake remains beyond direct prediction. Subduction science has learned that the largest surprise is often not the absence of data, but the assumption that the available data describes the full range of behavior. The Sumatra-Andaman rupture widened the expected scale. Tohoku widened it again. Each revision left the science stronger because the models became better after reality exposed their boundaries. Along the Peru-Chile margin, that lesson remains embedded in every measurement. Scientists are not working from a blank map, and they are not waiting for a mysterious event to reveal whether the fault is active. They already know the boundary moves, they know where strain is accumulating, and they know that sections of it are locked. What remains uncertain is how the entire system might behave when those constraints are finally tested together. Lima stands on a coastline shaped by a fault system that does not appear on the streets above it. With a metropolitan population of more than 11 million, the Peruvian capital occupies one of the most consequential urban spaces along the eastern Pacific margin. Beneath the ocean offshore, portions of the plate boundary remain coupled, allowing deformation to accumulate while the city continues its ordinary rhythms. Farther south, Antofagasta lies close to the northern Chilean portion of the trench. Richards Deep, the deepest measured point of the trench, is roughly 160 kilometers, about 100 miles, offshore. Between the city and that depression lies an ocean surface that gives little visual indication of the geological boundary beneath it. Yet the relationship is direct. The same tectonic system that shapes the seafloor also determines the conditions under which coastal infrastructure must exist. Valparaiso presents another kind of connection. Chile's principal port city occupies a coastline repeatedly affected by great earthquakes throughout its history. Its harbor, roads, buildings, utilities, and surrounding communities have all been developed within a landscape where large ruptures are part of the geological record. The city is not positioned beside an occasional disturbance. It occupies a margin where major earthquakes have returned across centuries. The Mal earthquake of 2010 made that relationship tangible on a vast scale. The magnitude, 8.8, rupture, damaged or destroyed approximately 220,000 homes and caused more than 500 deaths. Economic losses were estimated at around 30 billion United States dollars. The earthquake was enormous, yet it still belonged to the established range of behavior documented along this margin. Its significance came partly from the realization that a rupture of such scale could occur within a system that remains active beneath populated coastlines. Northern Chile and southern Peru contain sections where the geological record and modern measurements converge. Some of these seismic gaps have experienced long intervals without a complete great rupture. Their surfaces may appear unchanged from one season to the next, while instruments detect the gradual deformation associated with continuing plate convergence. The absence of a recent major earthquake does not mean the boundary has stopped moving. It can mean that movement is being stored in another form. That stored deformation matters because the coastal cities above the margin are not empty landscapes. Hospitals stand beside roads and utility corridors. Schools occupy districts that extend toward the shoreline. Ports connect regional economies to international trade, while water systems, electrical networks, bridges, and communications depend upon ground that can move differently from one neighborhood to another during a large earthquake. The geography creates another layer of vulnerability. Many of the communities exposed to shaking are also close to the ocean, where a large offshore rupture can alter the seafloor and generate tsunami waves. The same event can therefore affect buildings through ground motion and then transform the coastline through moving water. The consequences unfold through connected systems rather than within a single boundary. For scientists studying this margin, the human geography gives every measurement a physical address. A change recorded by an instrument represents deformation occurring beneath a continent containing millions of people. A locked patch on a map corresponds to a section of fault beneath an ocean used by ships beside cities filled with homes and offshore from ports that sustain entire economies. The resulting picture is not one of constant disaster. Most days pass without any visible geological disturbance. The significance lies in the contrast between ordinary life and the immense tectonic process beneath it. The fault can accumulate strain for years while traffic moves through Lima, ships enter Valparaiso, and Antofagasta continues its coastal life. The boundary remains active through all of it, measuring time not in hours or calendars, but in the gradual deformation of a continent. A map of the Peru-Chile margin changes character when its full length is allowed to remain in view. The boundary stretches for about 5,900 kilometers, roughly 3,666 miles, following the western edge of South America for a distance greater than the width of the United States. Its scale is easy to overlook because the trench is usually shown as a narrow line, but that line represents an active boundary extending across an immense portion of a continent. The San Andreas Fault, one of the most closely studied fault systems in the world, extends for about 1,300 kilometers, roughly 800 miles. The Cascadia subduction zone, farther north along the Pacific coast of North America, extends for about 1,100 kilometers, roughly 700 miles. The Peru-Chile Trench is more than 4 times longer than either of these structures. Length alone does not determine the size of an earthquake. A fault can extend for thousands of kilometers, while rupturing only a limited section. That distinction was written into the Great Earthquake of 1960. Its rupture traveled across about 1,000 kilometers, roughly 620 miles, an immense distance by any measure, yet it occupied only part of the larger plate boundary. Thousands of kilometers of the trench remained outside that particular rupture. This is where the architecture becomes important. Earthquakes grow when a portion of a fault releases accumulated strain, and the amount of fault that breaks together is one of the factors controlling the total energy released. A longer, locked interface provides more physical area that could, under the right conditions, participate in one rupture. It does not mean that the entire boundary will break at once, only that the geological structure permits different scales of rupture. Scientists therefore treat the possibility of very large ruptures with careful qualification. A hypothetical event involving a substantially greater length of the Peru-Chile boundary could produce an earthquake approaching magnitude 10, and some calculations allow a value above that threshold. No such earthquake has been identified in the geological record, and there is no evidence that the entire trench can rupture as one continuous event. The point is not prediction. It is the unusual combination of dimensions and tectonic behavior that makes the upper limit worth studying. The same reasoning explains why the length of the Mariana Trench has a different meaning. Mariana is an immense subduction system, but its geological setting does not produce the same sequence of great continental margin earthquakes. Its depth records the distance between the ocean surface and the deepest part of the seafloor. Along Peru and Chile, length becomes part of a much larger equation involving convergence, friction, accumulated strain, and the possibility of rupture spreading from one section into another. Seen from above, 5,900 kilometers, roughly 3,666 miles, is simply a distance. Beneath that distance lies a continuous boundary where an oceanic plate is being drawn beneath a continent. Every segment has its own history, its own geometry, and its own degree of coupling. Some sections release movement gradually, others remain restrained. The great earthquake of 1960, therefore, becomes smaller in one particular sense when placed against the full architecture of the trench. Its rupture was enormous, but it was not the whole boundary. The remaining length was still part of the same moving system, carrying its own geological history and responding to the same long process of convergence. The significance of the trench is not contained in one earthquake or one depth. It lies in the extraordinary scale of the structure that can produce them. Above the trench, the ocean becomes unexpectedly generous. Along the western coast of South America, the Humboldt Current carries cold water northward, while persistent winds draw deeper water toward the surface. That water arrives, carrying nutrients gathered from the depths, creating one of the most productive marine environments on the planet. The richness begins with upwelling. As surface water moves away from the coast, deeper water rises to replace it, bringing nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients into sunlight. Microscopic phytoplankton respond almost immediately, turning those dissolved materials into new biological growth. Tiny organisms become food for anchovies and sardines, which support larger fish, seabirds, sea lions, and other predators throughout the coastal ecosystem. The geography beneath this productivity is closely connected to the tectonic history of the margin. The Andes and the coastal mountains influence atmospheric circulation, while the shape of the continental margin helps guide ocean currents and coastal upwelling. The same long interaction between the Nazca Plate and South America that built the continental landscape has therefore helped create the physical setting in which this unusually productive ocean can exist. One species has become especially important. The Peruvian anchoveta supports one of the largest fisheries on Earth, with catches reaching several million metric tons in productive years. These small fish gather in enormous schools, feeding on plankton and transferring the energy captured by microscopic organisms into a form that can be harvested at industrial scale. Their influence extends far beyond the coastline. Anchoveta are processed into fish meal and fish oil, ingredients used extensively in aquaculture and animal feed. The catch, therefore, becomes part of a much larger food network, connecting the waters of Peru and Chile with farms, markets, and consumers across South America, Asia, and other regions. A fish that begins life in a cold coastal current can eventually become part of a food system thousands of kilometers, roughly thousands of miles, away. The ecosystem also supports creatures that seem almost out of place beside such an industrially important fishery. Humboldt penguins gather along rocky shores. South American sea lions rest on coastal islands and beaches. Guanay, cormorants, and other seabirds follow the movement of fish through the current, sometimes forming immense colonies where food remains abundant. Yet the productivity of this ocean has a geological vulnerability. A major earthquake along the margin can generate a tsunami capable of altering ports, harbors, roads, processing facilities, and coastal settlements. The physical infrastructure supporting the fishery occupies the same coastline shaped by the tectonic boundary beneath the sea. There is an unusual intimacy between these two systems. The trench does not simply sit beneath an unrelated ecosystem. The shape of the continent, the circulation of the coastal ocean, and the movement of nutrients through the water are connected through a geological history that has unfolded over millions of years. Even the apparent abundance at the surface depends on processes that begin far below. Nutrients rise from deeper water. Microscopic life captures energy from sunlight. Fish consume that living layer, and larger animals follow. At the same time, beneath the seafloor, the tectonic plates continue their gradual movement. The result is a coastline where geology and biology are woven together unusually tightly. Below the waves lies a boundary capable of producing some of Earth's largest earthquakes. Above it lies an ocean whose productivity supports an immense web of life and an international food industry. The same margin that stores geological strain also sustains biological abundance, linking the movement beneath the seafloor with everything living in the water above. The first human descent into the Atacama Trench began with a boundary that had existed in scientific maps for generations, yet had never appeared before a human eye. On January 13th, 2022, explorer Victor Vescovo and Chilean oceanographer Dr. Osvaldo Ulloa descended from the surface aboard the submersible limiting factor, heading toward the deepest part of a trench that had previously been known only through instruments, sonar, and unmanned vehicles. As the submersible sank, sunlight faded through the water column until the surrounding ocean became entirely dark. At about 100 meters, roughly 330 feet, natural light had disappeared completely. From that point downward, the outside world existed only where the submersible's lights reached, a small illuminated space surrounded by an ocean whose depth could no longer be sensed visually. The descent continued through water under enormous pressure toward a seafloor that had been measured remotely but never touched by a human expedition. At the bottom, the instruments recorded a depth of about 8,070 meters, roughly 26,473 feet. Vescovo and Ulloa had reached the floor of the Atacama Trench, becoming the first people to see that part of the seafloor directly. For Ulloa, the significance was deeply personal as well as scientific. Humans had spent decades constructing increasingly detailed maps of this environment without ever physically entering it. The expedition transformed a remote point on a chart into a place that could be observed through human presence, with rocks, sediment, water movement, and living organisms becoming visible rather than inferred. The dive was followed days later by another descent. This time, Dr. Ruben Escribano joined Vescovo and reached about 7,727 meters, roughly 25,351 feet, along the eastern slope of Richards Deep. The area had been mapped remotely for years, yet direct observation revealed details that sonar images could not provide. That distinction is important in the deepest ocean. A map can show the shape of a landscape, but it cannot reveal how sediment rests across its surface, how organisms gather within small depressions, or how biological communities respond to subtle changes in the seafloor. Remote instruments can measure depth and structure with extraordinary precision, but a camera carried into the environment can reveal relationships that measurements alone leave hidden. Much of what the expedition encountered had been anticipated from earlier unmanned lander missions. Researchers already knew that organisms occupied hadal depths, and they had gathered sediment samples from the region. Yet seeing the environment directly introduced another level of detail. The trench floor was not an abstract endpoint beneath thousands of meters of water. It was a physical landscape shaped by sediment movement, geological processes, and living communities adapted to conditions found nowhere near the surface. The two dives also demonstrated how little direct human experience existed within this immense trench. The first descent had taken place more than half a century after humanity first reached the deepest point of the Mariana Trench. Yet the Peru-Chile margin had remained largely inaccessible to crude exploration. Its remote location, extreme depth, and challenging sea conditions had kept the floor beyond direct human observation. For a few hours, the lights of the limiting factor moved across a place that had previously existed only as measurements and interpretations. The seafloor was no longer merely a depth on a chart. It had become an observed landscape with its own textures, organisms, and geological character entering the human record for the first time. At the bottom of the Atacama Trench, the first surprise was not geological, it was biological. When the lights of the limiting factor reached the seafloor, they revealed a density of life that challenged one of the simplest expectations of deep ocean ecology. With increasing depth, sunlight disappears, surface production becomes more distant, and food generally becomes harder to obtain. In most deep ocean environments, that scarcity shapes the community itself. Animals become fewer, energy moves slowly through the ecosystem, and the seafloor can appear almost empty compared with productive waters above. The Atacama Trench offered something different. Across the sediment lay holothurians, commonly known as sea cucumbers, gathered in remarkable numbers. Rather than isolated animals moving through a vast expanse of mud, the expedition encountered a concentrated community extending across the hadal floor. Victor Vescovo described the concentration as unlike anything he had previously witnessed in a trench environment. Some of the animals had forms unlike those already documented from earlier unmanned deployments in the region. Their bodies appeared translucent and gelatinous beneath the submersible's lights, delicate shapes moving across a landscape where the pressure was immense and the available energy should have been scarce. Direct observation could reveal details that preserved specimens and remote cameras could not fully convey, including differences in shape, behavior, and the way these animals occupied the sediment. The explanation begins far above them, along the same continental margin where the trench meets the productive waters of the Humboldt Current. Every day, organisms near the surface consume nutrients, grow, reproduce, and eventually return some of that biological material to the ocean. Fragments of dead organisms, discarded tissues, fecal particles, and other organic matter begin a slow descent through the water column. Scientists call this falling material marine snow. Most of it is consumed or decomposed before reaching great depth. Yet the waters above the Peru-Chile margin are unusually productive, continually supplying organic material to the deeper ocean. Some portion survives the descent, carrying energy downward in a form that can be used by organisms living far beyond the reach of sunlight. The shape of the trench changes what happens next. Its steep walls guide sediment and organic particles toward deeper regions, while the V-shaped floor creates a natural collecting zone. Material that might remain widely scattered across a broad abyssal plain can instead become concentrated within the trench. The result is an unusual connection between surface productivity and hadal life, with biological material produced near the sunlit ocean eventually gathering thousands of meters below it. That connection gives the deepest part of the trench an ecological character that its depth alone would never suggest. The animals living there are not separated from the productive ocean above by an absolute boundary. They are part of the same system, linked by falling particles, currents, sediment movement, and time. Even the deepest floor, therefore, participates in a cycle that begins near the surface. Nutrients lifted towards sunlight by ocean circulation become food for microscopic life, then fish and larger animals, and eventually fragments of that living world descend through darkness toward the trench. At the bottom, those remnants become nourishment for creatures adapted to pressure that would crush most surface organisms. The trench gathers more than tectonic stress. It also gathers the remains of an exceptionally productive ocean, concentrating energy where conventional expectations of scarcity would suggest almost none should remain. This does not make the hadal floor abundant in the same way as a coastal reef. Energy still arrives slowly, and every organism exists within severe physical limits. Yet abundance is not determined by depth alone. It depends on where food travels, how currents move it, and whether the shape of the seafloor allows that material to accumulate. In that sense, the trench behaves almost like a collector. Its depth isolates the ecosystem from sunlight, but its geometry connects it to the immense biological productivity above. The same ocean that supports fisheries along the coast sends a faint stream of its own remains downward, particle by particle, until the deepest sediment receives them. The result is a rare ecological paradox, a place defined by extreme pressure that can still receive a steady inheritance from the living ocean overhead. Life at the bottom is therefore not an exception to the surface system, but one of its most distant expressions. The rock walls of the Atacama Trench carried a second kind of landscape, one that did not depend on the rain of organic particles descending from the surface. Along exposed stone, the expedition observed long bacterial filaments extending from places where sunlight could never reach. They were delicate structures, almost thread-like beneath the submersible lights, yet their presence pointed toward a completely different source of energy. These communities were associated with chemosynthesis, a way of building biological energy without sunlight. Photosynthesis begins with light captured near the ocean's surface. Chemosynthesis begins with chemical reactions instead. Microorganisms can draw energy from reduced compounds such as hydrogen sulfide, methane, or dissolved iron, using those reactions to support metabolism and growth. In an environment buried beneath thousands of meters of seawater, chemistry can become the foundation that sunlight once provided elsewhere. What made the observation especially interesting was its setting. The organisms were attached to rock faces within a trench created by the convergence of the Nazca Plate and the South American Plate. Here, rock is continually buried, fractured, heated, compressed, and chemically altered as one plate descends beneath another. Fluids moving through sediments and fractured rock can carry dissolved compounds upward or sideways, creating localized chemical environments where microbial life can obtain energy. The connection between geology and biology is therefore more intimate than a simple food chain. The same tectonic setting that creates the trench also creates pathways through which water and dissolved chemicals circulate. As rocks are altered under pressure and temperature, minerals can react with fluids, changing the chemistry available to microorganisms. In some parts of the deep ocean, faults and fractures provide routes for methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other reduced compounds to reach habitats where chemosynthetic communities can develop. That does not mean earthquakes themselves are feeding the bacteria. The distinction matters. There is no evidence that a single rupture releases a sudden meal for these organisms, or that the locked fault directly powers their metabolism. Instead, the broader geological system continually reshapes the physical and chemical conditions beneath the ocean. Tectonic deformation, fluid movement, sediment burial, and mineral reactions operate over timescales far longer than an individual earthquake. Even so, the relationship creates an unusual biological echo of the trench's deeper machinery. The fault system is not simply a boundary between two pieces of crust, it is part of a moving chemical environment where pressure, deformation, fluids, and minerals interact beneath the seafloor. Life can occupy some of the spaces created by those interactions, adapting its metabolism to resources that would be unavailable in sunlit waters. For the bacteria, no surface light is necessary. Their energy comes from chemistry already present in the surrounding rock and fluids. Their existence also shows why the deepest ocean cannot be understood through depth alone. Hadal ecosystems are shaped by the material arriving from above, but also by processes occurring within the seafloor itself. A single trench can therefore contain two overlapping energy systems. Marine snow carries organic matter downward from the productive waters above, while chemical reactions within sediments and rocks can generate another source of energy from below. One pathway begins with sunlight and ends in falling particles. The other begins with geology and ends in microbial metabolism. At the Atacama Trench, those pathways meet along the walls of a place created by moving plates. The organisms do not need to know anything about earthquakes. They simply occupy a chemical landscape that the Earth has been building around them, molecule by molecule, through the slow interaction of rock, water, pressure, and time. Their world is built from geology itself. At the bottom of the Pacific, distance can become a force of evolution. The Peru-Chile Trench is separated from the Mariana, Tonga, and Kermadec trenches by vast stretches of deep ocean, leaving its deepest communities, surrounded by environments that are difficult for hadal organisms to cross. Over immense spans of time, that separation can make a trench resemble an island, not because it rises above the sea, but because its inhabitants are confined to a particular geological world. For organisms living under extreme pressure, the barriers are physical as well as biological. Water masses may connect distant parts of the ocean, yet the animals adapted to hadal depths cannot simply travel across thousands of miles of ordinary seafloor and remain within the conditions their bodies require. Populations become separated, reproduction occurs within local communities, and small differences can accumulate across generations. This is the setting in which endemism develops. An endemic species is one found naturally in a particular region and nowhere else. On land, isolation can produce distinctive animals such as the finches of the Galapagos Islands or the Komodo dragon. In a deep trench, the same evolutionary principle can operate without mountains, forests, or visible islands. The barrier is depth, pressure, distance, and the unusual shape of the seafloor itself. Among the organisms associated with the Atacama Trench is a hadal snailfish known as Nodoliparus antoniocoroi. Its body is adapted to conditions that would be impossible for most surface fish, including pressure approaching the limits at which proteins and cell membranes can continue functioning normally. Other trench communities include polychaete worms and amphipods, small crustaceans that occupy sediments and consume organic material delivered into the deepest environment. Xenophyophores add another strange form to this isolated community. These enormous single-celled organisms can grow to several inches across, constructing delicate structures from sediment and organic particles. Although they resemble plants or primitive animals at first glance, they belong to a completely different branch of life. Their presence demonstrates how unfamiliar the architecture of deep ocean ecosystems can become when evolution operates under conditions absent from the surface. Bacteria add another layer to this biological separation. Some deep communities possess metabolic capabilities suited to the chemical conditions of trench sediments, allowing microorganisms to obtain energy from compounds unavailable to organisms dependent on sunlight. Each population carries a history written not only in its genes, but also in the chemistry and geology surrounding it. The important distinction is that isolation does not mean absolute separation. Currents still move through the Pacific, particles still fall from productive waters, and occasional organisms or genetic material may travel beyond their usual habitat. Evolutionary isolation is a matter of degree. What matters is that enough separation persists for local populations to follow their own paths. Over millions of years, those paths can become increasingly distinct. A small adaptation that offers an advantage under extreme pressure may become common within one population. A change in metabolism may allow another organism to exploit a chemical resource. Differences that begin almost imperceptibly can eventually produce species found nowhere beyond the boundaries of their particular trench environment. The Peru-Chile Trench, therefore, holds something more subtle than simple depth. Its isolation has allowed an evolutionary history to unfold with a degree of independence, creating a community shaped by pressure, chemistry, sediment, and geography. The result is an underwater island whose borders cannot be seen from the surface. Far above, the ocean appears continuous, one immense body of moving water. At Haddle depth, the same ocean becomes a collection of separate worlds, each with its own pressures, food pathways, geological structures, and evolutionary histories. In the Atacama Trench, millions of years of isolation have turned those invisible boundaries into living differences, leaving behind species whose natural home may be nowhere else on Earth. In the deepest reaches of the Peru-Chile Trench, evolution left a signature that was small enough to fit in a scientist's hand. In October 2023, the Integrated Deep Ocean Observing System expedition aboard the research vessel Abate Molina lowered a lander to about 7,900 meters, roughly 25,900 feet, into the trench. When the lander returned, it carried 4 amphipods, unlike anything the team had previously collected there. An amphipod is a small crustacean, often associated with the scavenging communities of the deep ocean. Many hadal amphipods survive by consuming organic material that drifts down from productive waters above. They are part of a slow recycling system, gathering fragments of life that reach the seafloor after their long descent. These 4 animals suggested something different. Their bodies were examined alongside genetic evidence at the University of Concepcion, allowing researchers to compare both their physical form and evolutionary relationships with known amphipods. The results placed them outside the recognized genera. Rather than representing another species within an existing lineage, they represented a branch of amphipod evolution that had not previously been described. The new genus was named Dulcibella camanchaca. The animals measured about 4 centimeters, roughly 1½ inches in length. Their most distinctive feature was not their size, but their appendages. Specialized raptorial limbs projected from the body, shaped for grasping and securing prey rather than simply collecting material from sediment. That difference changes the ecological picture of the trench. A scavenger waits for energy to arrive from somewhere else. A predator actively searches for another living organism and captures it. The distinction is subtle in appearance, yet profound in what it reveals about an ecosystem. To support an active hunter, a habitat must contain enough accessible prey to make pursuit worthwhile. The discovery therefore provides evidence that the deepest Atacama environment is more structurally complex than a simple downward flow of marine snow. Organic particles still reach the floor, but they can become the foundation of an entire food web. Microorganisms process them, smaller animals consume those organisms, and larger creatures can emerge to hunt within the community. Dulcibella camanchaca appears to occupy that higher level. Its raptorial appendages suggest a lifestyle built around active capture, giving the trench a predator adapted to conditions where sunlight never enters and pressure is immense. The animal does not need the familiar visual world of surface predators. Its environment provides different signals, different resources, and different constraints. What makes the finding especially unusual is its evolutionary setting. Hadal trenches are separated from one another by enormous distances and by vast regions of seafloor, where pressure and depth differ from the conditions found in the deepest zones. Populations living within one trench can therefore experience long periods of limited exchange with comparable communities elsewhere. Over geological time, that isolation can redirect evolution. A lineage does not need to become larger or more complex simply because its environment is extreme. It changes according to the opportunities available within that environment. In the Atacama Trench, those opportunities appear to have included active predation, allowing an amphipod lineage to develop a hunting strategy not previously documented from the trench. The animal is small, but its meaning extends far beyond its body. A new genus is not merely another name added to a catalog. It is evidence of an evolutionary history that remained hidden because the habitat itself remained almost inaccessible. At depths of roughly 8 kilometers, about 5 miles beneath the surface, the trench was still generating forms of life that science had never encountered. The discovery of Dulcibella camanchaca showed that isolation had done more than preserve an unusual community. It had given evolution enough time and separation to produce a hunter found nowhere else yet known. Far above the trench, the Atacama Desert holds another kind of biological record, one written not in layers of stone, but in organisms that have endured where change has been unusually slow. Along this immense coastal margin, researchers have encountered living brachiopods and chitons, groups whose ancient representatives are abundant in the fossil record. Their presence adds another dimension to the isolation already visible beneath the ocean. The connection becomes more intriguing when the desert itself is considered. The Atacama receives so little rainfall that some of its landscapes have remained exceptionally stable for immense spans of time. Fog from the Pacific can still reach inland valleys, carrying microscopic life from the ocean. Microalgae with marine origins have been identified within this airborne moisture, suggesting that the boundary between desert and sea is more porous than the landscape appears. For evolutionary biologists, such persistence offers a useful clue. When an environment changes repeatedly, organisms face shifting pressures that favor new traits, new behaviors, and new ecological relationships. But where conditions remain remarkably consistent, some lineages can retain ancient characteristics for very long periods. They still evolve, of course, yet the direction and pace of that change can differ from organisms living in more variable surroundings. That possibility becomes especially interesting beneath the water. The deepest parts of the Peru-Chile Trench are separated from the surface by immense pressure, darkness, and physical distance. Seasonal changes above do not reach the seafloor in the same direct way they reach shallow ecosystems. The trench also has its own circulation, sediments, chemistry, and food pathways, creating an environment whose conditions can persist across generations of organisms. This does not mean that evolution stops at depth. Natural selection never simply switches off. A living population continues to accumulate genetic differences, and environmental changes can still favor some traits over others. The idea of a living fossil is therefore more precise than the phrase suggests. It describes a modern organism whose overall body plan remains strikingly similar to that of much older relatives known from fossils, not an animal literally frozen in evolutionary time. That distinction matters because the fossil record preserves forms that once occupied ancient oceans, while living descendants reveal which characteristics can remain useful across extraordinary spans of time. If a lineage survives within a stable refuge, its anatomy may retain features that disappeared elsewhere as environments changed. The resemblance would not prove that the organism had escaped evolution, only that certain ancient solutions remained workable under conditions that eliminated many newer alternatives. In that sense, survival itself becomes evidence about the endurance of form. The Atacama region provides a natural laboratory for studying this possibility because the desert and trench form an unusual pair. Both are shaped by the same coastal tectonic setting, yet they experience radically different conditions. Above, intense aridity limits biological activity. Below, pressure and isolation create a separate world where surface disturbances are greatly reduced. Between them lies a geological boundary that has existed for millions of years. The Schmidt Ocean Institute has investigated the deep environment with precisely this broader question in mind, examining organisms, sediments, and habitats that cannot be understood from surface observations alone. Every specimen brought upward carries information about ancestry, adaptation, and persistence. A living fossil, if confirmed in the trench, would therefore be more than an unusual animal. It would be a biological document, preserved not by freezing, but by geography. Its existence would suggest that the deepest ocean can shelter lineages whose histories extend far beyond the modern coastline, carrying fragments of ancient life into a world that still exists beneath our own. Beneath the instruments and cables, the sediment preserves a different kind of measurement. It does not record an earthquake as a number on a screen. Instead, each disturbance leaves a physical trace, a layer deposited across the floor after the seafloor has been shaken, and the slopes above it begin to move. A powerful rupture can destabilize enormous quantities of sediment along the continental margin. Material breaks loose, gathers speed, and travels downslope as a dense underwater current. These flows are known as turbidity currents, and the deposits they leave behind are called turbidites. Within them, the violence of a distant earthquake becomes visible through the arrangement of grains. A typical turbidite begins with relatively coarse sediment, followed upward by progressively finer material as the current loses energy. Above that layer, ordinary settling resumes, with microscopic particles and organic remains accumulating gradually from the water column. Over time, another disturbance may place a new layer across the older one. The result is a sequence that can be read much like pages stacked beneath the seafloor. Researchers recover these pages using sediment cores, long cylinders that penetrate the floor and preserve its vertical order. The deepest sections may contain deposits formed long before modern instruments existed. Grain size, thickness, composition, and the position of each layer relative to others can reveal whether a deposit was produced by an ordinary background process or by an unusually energetic event. The record becomes especially valuable because instruments have watched the Peru-Chile margin for only a short portion of its geological history. Written measurements from seismometers and coastal stations reach back only decades, while sediments can preserve evidence from thousands of years. The two records therefore occupy different scales. One captures individual events with remarkable precision. The other reveals how often great disturbances have returned across generations that left no written account. Dating these layers adds another dimension. Scientists can compare sediment sequences with known earthquakes, volcanic deposits, changes in microscopic marine organisms, and other chronological markers. When several distant cores contain matching layers of similar age, the evidence can indicate that one large event affected a broad portion of the margin. In this way, a disturbance that occurred before modern observation can be reconstructed from traces scattered across the trench. The pattern matters more than any single layer. Repeated thick deposits show that major earthquakes and associated submarine landslides are not isolated curiosities. They belong to the long geological behavior of an active convergent margin. The trench has been reshaped again and again by movements that occurred long before anyone could place a sensor on the seafloor. Some portions of the sediment column contain so many disturbance layers that ordinary background accumulation becomes almost a narrow interval between larger events. What appears at first to be a simple floor is therefore a compressed history of changing slopes, collapsing sediments, and sudden releases of tectonic energy. Yet, the record carries an important limit. A turbidite does not provide a perfect earthquake magnitude, and not every underwater sediment flow must have been triggered by an earthquake. Storms, volcanic activity, and other processes can disturb the margin. Scientists must compare multiple lines of evidence before assigning a layer to a particular rupture. Each boundary marks a change in the character of the seafloor, turning an otherwise ordinary deposit into evidence of a vanished moment in time. That caution makes the sediment record more valuable, not less. It transforms the trench from a place observed for a few human lifetimes into a geological archive extending across thousands of years. Beneath the water, the past remains arranged in layers, waiting to be read. The seafloor is only the beginning of the sediment world. Beneath the upper layers, where sunlight has never reached and oxygen becomes scarce, another form of life can persist within the spaces between mineral grains. In 2025, researchers examining hadal trenches in the Northwest Pacific documented extensive chemosynthesis-based communities and found evidence that microbial activity deep within trench sediments can generate methane from carbon dioxide derived from buried organic matter. The discovery expanded the known role of life beneath the ocean floor, and it offers a compelling lens through which to consider other active trenches, including the Peru-Chile system. The organisms responsible for this hidden chemistry do not depend directly on sunlight. Organic material arriving from productive surface waters becomes buried in sediment, where microorganisms transform it through reactions that can continue without oxygen. One important pathway reduces carbon dioxide to methane, storing part of the carbon in a chemically altered form. The methane can then accumulate within pore spaces, move through sediment, or become associated with deeper geological structures. What makes hadal trenches especially interesting is their shape. Their steep walls and narrow floors collect material from enormous surrounding areas. Sediment can arrive gradually from the water above or move downward during gravity driven flows triggered by landslides and earthquakes. Over long periods, this creates thick deposits, rich in organic material. Buried beneath newer layers, that material becomes fuel for microbial communities operating far beyond the reach of any camera. In the 2025 study, methane rich fluids were found in deep sediments, and chemical and isotopic evidence indicated that much of the methane had a microbial origin. The researchers also identified conditions compatible with methane hydrate, a solid structure in which methane becomes trapped within water under high pressure and low temperature. Such deposits show how unusual the chemistry beneath a hadal floor can become when immense pressure is combined with long periods of burial. The important distinction is that this is not simply life living on top of the trench. It is life functioning within the sediment itself. The surface community can receive organic particles from above, while deeper microorganisms work with the chemical products created as that material is buried and transformed. One layer of biology becomes the raw material for another, extending the ecosystem downward without requiring sunlight to reach it. This hidden activity also changes the way carbon moves through a subduction zone. Some organic carbon that enters a trench may be transformed before it is carried deeper beneath the overriding plate. Microbial processes can convert buried carbon into methane, while sediment may retain some of that carbon for long periods. The researchers emphasized that the quantity and ultimate fate of this stored carbon remain uncertain, and that broader sampling is needed before its importance to global carbon models can be measured confidently. For the Peru-Chile Trench, the implication is not that the same community has already been demonstrated there. Rather, its geology makes the possibility scientifically important. The 2025 research showed that hadal sediments can support active chemical ecosystems far deeper than traditional models of trench life had suggested. Similar geological settings may therefore contain comparable microbial processes that remain unsampled. The ocean floor, then, is not a boundary. It is a surface beneath which chemistry continues, sediment continues to change, and microorganisms continue to reshape matter. Beneath the trench floor, the planet still has another layer of living activity, hidden not by distance alone, but by the thickness of the Earth itself, where geology and biology remain intertwined beyond direct observation for countless generations. Carbon does not remain where life first captures it. Along the Peru-Chile margin, a portion of the material circulating through the surface ocean begins a much longer journey, one measured not in seasons or lifetimes, but in movements of the Earth itself. The Nazca Plate moves beneath South America at roughly 8 centimeters, about 3 inches, each year. That motion seems almost imperceptible beside the movement of waves or currents, yet over geological time, it becomes a conveyor carrying enormous quantities of sediment and chemically bound material toward the interior of the planet. Among that material is carbon that began its history in the atmosphere and surface ocean. Marine organisms draw carbon dioxide from seawater and incorporate carbon into living tissue. When those organisms die, fragments and waste descend through the water as part of the steady rain of organic matter known as marine snow. Much of it is consumed or decomposed before reaching the deep ocean, but some fraction settles onto the seafloor and becomes buried within sediment. In the trench, that burial takes place inside a landscape shaped to collect material from the surrounding margin. Burial changes the chemistry of the carbon. Microorganisms within oxygen, poor sediment, can break down organic compounds through chemical reactions that differ from those occurring near the surface. Some pathways produce methane, allowing part of the buried carbon to remain within the sediment in a transformed form. Other carbon compounds become incorporated into minerals or remain trapped within layers that are eventually carried toward the subduction zone. This creates an unusual meeting point between biology and tectonics. The microorganisms are not merely surviving beside a geological process. Their metabolism can alter the chemical form in which carbon continues its journey. Before the sediment is carried beneath South America, some of its carbon may already have been transformed, consumed, immobilized, or released as methane. Farther below, whatever remains within the subducting material enters a realm where pressure and temperature increase with depth. Water bound within minerals can be released during metamorphic reactions, while carbon bearing compounds may follow several possible pathways. Some carbon can be transported deeper into the mantle. Some may be returned toward the surface through volcanic and hydrothermal processes. The trench, therefore, acts not as a one-way drain, but as one stage within a planetary circulation system whose routes unfold over millions of years. The scale is difficult to see from the surface because the annual movement is so small, yet a plate traveling roughly 8 centimeters, about 3 inches, each year advances more than 80 meters, about 260 feet, over 1,000 years. Across a million years, that same motion amounts to roughly 80 kilometers, about 50 miles. Geological time turns small movements into continental consequences. What makes this margin especially distinctive is the way several carbon pathways meet in one place. Productive surface waters create abundant organic material. Ocean circulation delivers that material into deeper regions. The trench concentrates sediment. Microbial communities transform part of its chemistry. Subduction then carries a portion of the buried material beneath the continent. The same geological architecture that sustains a rich surface ecosystem can therefore help move its carbon into the deep earth. Some of that carbon remains in living communities. Some becomes sedimentary matter. Some is transformed into methane, and some may eventually cross the boundary between crust and mantle. Nothing in this cycle happens quickly. A particle that begins as part of microscopic ocean life can pass through water, sediment, rock, and living cells before becoming part of Earth's interior. The trench is one place where those paths converge, linking the biology of the ocean surface with the chemistry of buried sediment and the slow movement of the mantle below. The desert begins where the ocean should have been generous. Along the coast of northern Chile, the Atacama occupies a narrow world between the Pacific Ocean and the rising Andes. Its hyper-arid core receives less than 2 millimeters, about 1/10 of an inch, of rain in an average year. Some locations have gone years without measurable rainfall, while ancient surfaces remain exposed with remarkably little erosion. The dryness is not produced by one cause alone. It emerges from several parts of the regional Earth system working together. Even the desert floor preserves this history through salt crusts, weathered rocks, and surfaces that have changed extraordinarily slowly compared with wetter landscapes. Far offshore, the Humboldt Current carries cold water northward along the western edge of South America. That water chills the lower atmosphere and helps create a temperature inversion, with cooler air trapped beneath warmer air above. Moisture can gather near the surface as coastal fog, yet the atmosphere resists the rising motion needed to form deep rain clouds. The ocean is present, but its coldness helps keep its water from becoming rainfall over the desert. To the east, another barrier rises far higher. The Andes intercept moisture arriving from the interior of the continent, forcing humid air upward where much of its water falls as precipitation before the remaining air descends toward the Pacific side. By the time that air reaches the Atacama, much of its moisture has already been removed. The desert, therefore, sits between a cold ocean and a high mountain wall, receiving little water from either direction. Both features are connected to the same convergent margin, but the relationship is more subtle than a simple story in which the trench created the desert by itself. The Nazca Plate has been descending beneath South America for tens of millions of years, driving crustal shortening, volcanism, uplift, and the growth of the Andes. That evolving mountain system strengthened the rain shadow that now separates the Pacific coast from moisture arriving across the continent. The shape of the coastline also matters because the narrow coastal plain leaves little room for moist air to penetrate inland before encountering higher terrain. The cold coastal current has its own longer history, shaped by ocean circulation, continental geography, and changing climate. Its modern strength is not simply a product of the trench. Yet the tectonic landscape helps define the coastline and the atmospheric boundary over which that current operates. Subduction, mountain building, ocean circulation, and climate have gradually become intertwined. Recent geological evidence has added an important complication. Some ancient surfaces in the Atacama preserve signs of extreme aridity that may predate the major uplift of the modern Andes and even the establishment of the modern Humboldt Current. That means the desert was not born from one geological event. Its dryness developed through a long sequence of environmental changes, with tectonics intensifying conditions that other forces had already begun to create. Still, the connection remains striking. The same plate boundary that bends the ocean floor downward also raises a continental mountain range thousands of meters above sea level. That range changes the movement of atmospheric water. Offshore, the associated continental margin forms the setting for a cold current that further suppresses rainfall along the coast. Above the trench, then, the landscape records the influence of geology in a form that can be seen without instruments. A deep ocean boundary has helped shape mountains, coastlines, ocean circulation, and the distribution of moisture. The result is a desert whose exceptional dryness reflects not a single cause, but the accumulated architecture of an entire continental margin. A line drawn across northern Chile would pass through several worlds that appear unrelated at first glance. It would cross a desert where rain is almost absent, descend through a coastal ocean crowded with life, and continue downward toward a boundary where one tectonic plate disappears beneath another. Yet these places are not separate chapters of geography. They are parts of the same moving system. Far inland, the Atacama receives so little precipitation that exposed ground can remain preserved for extraordinary lengths of time. Its dryness is reinforced by atmospheric circulation, the cold waters of the Humboldt Current, and the rain shadow created by the Andes. None of these features exists in isolation from the continental margin. The mountains owe much of their elevation and structure to the long history of the Nazca Plate descending beneath South America, while the coastal configuration helps shape the ocean circulation that keeps the atmosphere unusually dry. Just offshore, that same ocean system produces an opposite condition. Cold water rising toward the surface carries nutrients from deeper layers into sunlight, where microscopic organisms convert them into the foundation of an immense food web. Anchoveta gather in vast schools, followed by seabirds, marine mammals, larger fish, and fleets of fishing vessels. The productivity is not an independent miracle placed beside the trench. It occupies the same margin, shaped by the same geography, and influenced by the same tectonic architecture. Below that living surface, the ocean floor bends downward into the hadal realm. The descending plate continues beneath the continent at roughly 8 centimeters, about 3 inches, each year. That motion is slow enough to disappear from ordinary human perception, yet over geological time, it becomes a journey of enormous consequence. Sediment is carried downward, faults accumulate strain, rock deforms, heats, fractures, and changes. Earthquakes release portions of that stored energy, while the trench itself provides a pathway into deeper layers of the planet. At the bottom, the consequences become biological again. Organic material produced in the sunlit ocean settles through the water and reaches the deepest sediments. Microorganisms process some of that carbon. Other organisms consume the life that gathers there. Specialized predators occupy ecological roles shaped by isolation, pressure, and the chemistry of the trench. Even the sediment beneath the floor contains microbial communities whose activity can alter the fate of carbon before it reaches the mantle. Seen from above, these extremes seem almost contradictory. One region is defined by the absence of water on land, another by extraordinary abundance in the sea, and another by geological instability beneath both. Yet the contradiction disappears when the scale changes. A tectonic boundary does not remain confined to the place where plates meet. Its influence travels upward into mountains, outward through ocean circulation, across ecosystems, and downward into the interior of the planet. The Nazca Plate does not move with the drama of a collapsing cliff. It advances by centimeters each year, carrying sediment and minerals toward a boundary that has been operating for millions of years. That persistence gives the system its unusual unity. The desert, the fishery, the earthquakes, and the deep biological communities are not four unrelated extremes gathered along one coastline. They are four expressions of a planet continually rearranging itself. The trench is therefore more than a deep place beneath the Pacific. Its depth is only the most visible measurement of a much larger process. Above it, mountains redirect moisture and currents distribute nutrients. Within it, earthquakes reshape the seafloor. Beneath it, carbon and minerals continue their descent. One moving plate links all of these worlds, turning a line on a map into a living geological system. For all the instruments watching the coast, one crucial part of the system remains beyond direct observation. The locked interface itself lies beneath the seafloor, hidden beneath layers of sediment and rock, where the Nazca Plate is forced beneath South America. Scientists can measure the consequences of strain accumulating across the margin, but they cannot place a sensor directly on the boundary where that strain is stored. Across the continent, networks of seismometers detect earthquakes, and global positioning instruments measure movements of the land with extraordinary precision. When the ground rises, sinks, or shifts sideways, these changes reveal how the crust responds to forces deep below. Yet such measurements are indirect. They show the surface expression of a process occurring far beneath it, like reading the movement of a distant landscape, while the mechanism beneath remains concealed. The difficulty becomes greater beneath the ocean. Water separates conventional instruments from the fault, and the seafloor itself is constantly shaped by sediment, movement, currents, biological activity, and the slow deformation of the margin. A station on land can reveal that strain is accumulating somewhere offshore, but it cannot resolve every small change occurring along the buried interface. The difference matters because a fault is not a single smooth surface behaving uniformly. Some sections may remain firmly locked while neighboring areas deform more readily, creating a patchwork of mechanical conditions that can change through time. Ocean bottom seismometers offer another kind of view. These instruments rest directly on the seafloor and can detect very small earthquakes that may be difficult to distinguish within signals recorded from land. Many of these events involve tiny adjustments of the crust, far below the threshold of human perception. Individually, they may seem insignificant. Collectively, their locations, depths, and timing can reveal how stress migrates through the fault system and which portions of the boundary are becoming active. The integrated deep ocean observing system grew from the realization that the deepest part of the problem also requires measurements taken at the deepest part of the margin. The goal is to establish long-term instruments across the seafloor, measuring deformation, pressure, seismic activity, and other changes directly where the plates interact. Instead of inferring every movement from distant stations, researchers could compare signals from the ocean floor with those recorded on land, building a much more complete picture of how the boundary behaves. That difference could become especially important between major earthquakes when the surface may appear almost unchanged while strain continues accumulating below. Tiny movements, subtle shifts in pressure, and clusters of small seismic events might reveal patterns that disappear when observations are made only from shore. Such measurements would not provide a simple countdown to an earthquake. Fault systems are too complex for that. Their value would lie in showing which parts of the boundary are moving, which remain locked, and how those conditions evolve. For now, the instruments are still being expanded and the record remains incomplete. Scientists possess models, geological evidence, seismic observations, and measurements of crustal motion, yet the most important interface remains largely unseen. It represents a boundary in scientific knowledge, separating what can be inferred from what can be measured directly. Beneath the water, that distinction remains written into the sea floor itself, waiting for instruments capable of reading it continuously. Until then, the most important part of the system remains the least directly measured. The missing information is not merely another detail to add to a map. It is the difference between observing the effects of a fault and observing the fault itself, where continents, ocean floor, and stored geological strain meet beneath the water. There is a peculiar measure of the Peru and Chile Trench that cannot be expressed by its depth alone. It is the distance human observation has actually covered along its floor, a fraction so small that the known landscape may represent only a narrow sampling of a much larger world, spread across a geological boundary that continues far beyond the places where instruments have reached. During the joint China-Chile Atacama Trench expedition in 2026, the crewed submersible Fenduche completed more than 36 dives, reaching across roughly 180 kilometers, about 112 miles, of seafloor. Each descent added another small portion to the direct record of a trench that stretches for approximately 5,900 kilometers, about 3,666 miles, along the western edge of South America. Even taken together, those observations cover less than 3% of its total length. The remaining distance is not an empty space on a map. It is a sequence of slopes, ridges, sediment basins, fractured rock, buried channels, and isolated depressions whose physical conditions can change from one section to another. A camera passing through one part of the trench cannot establish what exists several hundred kilometers away. The chemistry may differ. The sediment may carry a different history. The communities living there may have adapted to local conditions that have never been sampled. A small change in terrain can alter how organic material settles, where currents concentrate nutrients, and which organisms find enough energy to persist. That distinction becomes important when the discoveries already made are placed beside one another. The dense holothurians found at extreme depth challenged expectations about how much food should reach the deepest floor. Filamentous bacterial growth revealed communities drawing energy from geological chemistry. Dulcibella camanchaca introduced a predatory amphipod, unlike the scavenging forms normally associated with hadal environments. Microbial activity beneath the sediment showed that the biological system continues below the visible seafloor itself. Other observations add still more layers to the picture. Cold seep communities demonstrate that chemical energy can support life where sunlight has never played a role. Coral growth at approximately 7,200 meters, about 23,600 feet, places complex organisms within depths once imagined as almost entirely inhospitable. Fossil-like lineages and specialized bacterial communities suggest that isolation can preserve unusual biological histories while also creating opportunities for new ones. What matters is not that every expedition discovers something strange in isolation. It is the consistency of the pattern. The observations repeatedly expand the range of what scientists must consider possible in this particular environment. Models built from distant trenches, remote measurements, and scattered samples provide useful foundations, yet direct observation keeps adding details that those foundations could not contain. The surprises are not isolated exceptions. They form a recurring signature of incomplete knowledge. A trench nearly 6,000 kilometers, about 3,700 miles, long cannot be understood from a handful of descents. Its shape alone creates countless local environments, while earthquakes continually rearrange the sediment and circulation moves material between regions. Life responds to those differences on scales, far smaller than the trench itself, creating communities that may exist within valleys, slopes, or sediment layers that have never been examined. The unexplored distance is therefore more than a blank portion of ocean. It represents an enormous collection of possible geological histories and biological adaptations, each waiting for the rare moment when an instrument reaches the right place. The trench has not revealed everything because it has been hiding its contents. It has revealed what can be reached, one descent at a time, while most of the seafloor remains beyond direct observation. Science has begun to see the pattern, but the landscape itself is still vastly larger than the part that human eyes and instruments have touched. The deepest point in the ocean belongs to the Mariana Trench, where Challenger Deep descends to about 11,000 meters, roughly 36,089 feet beneath the surface. Its depth has made it one of the defining places in oceanography, a natural measure of how far the planet can fold the seafloor downward. Humans first reached that depth in 1960, when Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh descended together inside the bathyscaphe Trieste. More than 5 decades later, James Cameron made a solo descent in 2012, followed by repeated expeditions that expanded direct observation of the deepest Pacific. The Mariana is extraordinary because of what happens at its greatest depth. Its pressures are immense, its temperatures are low, and its biological communities have adapted to conditions found nowhere near the surface. Yet the trench itself exists within a comparatively isolated geological setting. It does not form the central boundary of a continental system, carrying the same combination of mountains, earthquakes, ocean currents, fisheries, deserts, and sedimentary processes found along the western edge of South America. That difference becomes clearer when the two trenches are placed beside one another without reducing either to a simple contest of depth. The Mariana reaches farther downward, but the Peru and Chile Trench reaches outward through the surrounding Earth. Its subduction zone extends along a continental margin where the Nazca Plate continues beneath South America, deforming the crust, feeding the rise of the Andes, and accumulating strain along a fault capable of releasing enormous earthquakes. The consequences spread far beyond the trench itself. Above that boundary, the Humboldt Current supports one of the richest marine food webs on the planet. Its nutrient-rich waters sustain vast populations of anchovies, sardines, seabirds, marine mammals, and the fisheries that depend upon them. Farther inland, the Andes interrupt moisture arriving from the east, while coastal atmospheric conditions suppress rainfall arriving from the west. The resulting Atacama Desert occupies the same broad geological system, creating one of the driest landscapes on Earth. Beneath the water, the consequences continue in another direction. Sediment descending toward the trench carries organic material from the productive ocean above. Microbial communities transform portions of that carbon within the buried sediment, while the remainder can continue downward with the subducting plate. At the deepest levels, biological isolation has produced organisms with unusual forms and ecological roles, including the predatory amphipod Dulcibella camanchaca, a lineage unlike any previously documented from comparable hadal environments. The Mariana has its own biological history, and that history is no less valuable because the surrounding geology behaves differently. It offers scientists a natural laboratory for pressure, chemistry, adaptation, and the limits of life. Its great depth is a remarkable physical record, a place where the ocean reaches one of its most extreme dimensions. The Peru and Chile Trench carries another kind of significance. Its importance lies in the connections surrounding it, between ocean and continent, sediment and mantle, desert and current, earthquake and ecosystem. The trench is not merely a depression at the edge of a continent. It is one part of a geological machine whose effects emerge across thousands of kilometers and through many layers of the earth. Depth tells us how far the seafloor descends. It does not tell us how much of the planet is connected to that descent. In the Mariana, the measurement itself is the defining feature. Along Peru and Chile, the measurement is only one detail within a much larger process, still accumulating strain, still moving plates, still shaping land and ocean, and still changing the living world above and below it. There is a peculiar boundary between uncertainty and knowledge, and the Peru and Chile Trench sits directly upon it. Before a fault is understood, danger can remain vague, almost shapeless. Information seems to promise relief. Maps become clearer, measurements become more precise, and unknown territory begins to acquire names. Yet some geological systems produce the opposite effect. Here, each new measurement gives the future a sharper outline. Seismologists have spent decades studying the boundary where the Nazca Plate descends beneath South America. They can identify sections where the plates remain locked together instead of slipping smoothly. They can measure how the continent deforms as strain accumulates. They can compare the geometry of the fault with records preserved in sediments, coastal deposits, and ancient landscapes. Each source adds another piece to a history extending beyond the reach of written records. That history does not provide an escape from uncertainty. It defines the uncertainty more carefully. Scientists can estimate where a rupture is likely to begin, how far it could propagate, and which portions of the fault may release their accumulated strain together. They can model the size of the earthquake that different rupture scenarios could produce. They can calculate how seismic waves would move through the crust and how a tsunami generated offshore could travel toward populated coastlines. There is something unusual about knowledge when it reaches this level of precision. The unknown is no longer a blank space. It becomes a range of possible outcomes, each constrained by measurements and physical laws. The remaining uncertainty concerns timing, not whether the geological process exists. The fault is still moving toward another release of strain, even while the people studying it are measuring that movement. A sensor placed on the seafloor cannot persuade the plates to stop. A more detailed model cannot weaken the boundary. An improved map cannot redistribute the stress already stored within the crust. Scientific observation changes what humanity knows, but it does not change the tectonic process being observed. The Earth does not adjust its schedule to the arrival of better instruments. That is why the observing systems planned for this region carry a meaning beyond ordinary scientific curiosity. Ocean bottom instruments can record tiny changes occurring close to the fault, traces of deformation, and small earthquakes that may never be visible to instruments on land. They can reveal how individual locked patches behave, whether strain is spreading, and how the fault responds to smaller movements. Such measurements may eventually narrow the interval between detection and rupture. They may improve forecasts, strengthen warnings, and give coastal communities more time to respond when the system finally changes. But no instrument can turn a geological inevitability into a preventable event. The distinction becomes especially clear when warning is separated from prediction. A sensor might detect a change already underway, but detection is not the same as knowing the exact moment of failure. Earthquake rupture is governed by interacting stresses, friction, rock properties, fluids, and fault geometry, many of which vary beneath the seafloor. Even a dense network of instruments would leave some uncertainty intact. What it could provide is something more modest and more valuable, a closer view of the final stages of a process that cannot be stopped. The deeper unease comes from that distinction. Science can illuminate the mechanism without controlling it. It can describe the fault in greater detail, reconstruct its older ruptures, and monitor its present behavior, yet the final movement belongs to the Earth itself. Knowledge does not close the story. It removes the comfort of not knowing why the story must continue. At the bottom of the Peru and Chile Trench, life follows a logic that begins far above the seafloor. The organisms living there are not simply surviving conditions that happen to be extreme. Their existence is tied to the geological processes that created those conditions, linking pressure, chemistry, food, and evolution into one continuous chain. Far overhead, nutrients rise through the Humboldt Current and support enormous biological productivity along the South American coast. When organisms die, fragments of that productivity descend through the water column as marine snow. In the trench, the steep surrounding slopes and deep basin can concentrate this material, delivering organic matter to places where food would otherwise be scarce. Holothurians move across the sediment, consuming this accumulated material, turning the remains of surface life into energy for an ecosystem separated from the sunlight that created its food in the first place. Other organisms draw their energy from a completely different source. Along fractures and chemically active areas, fluids emerging from the seafloor can carry compounds that microorganisms use to obtain energy through chemosynthesis. These communities do not depend directly on sunlight or on freshly fallen organic matter. Their energy comes from the chemistry produced by the interaction of seawater, rocks, heat, and the fluids moving through the crust. The same tectonic system that stores strain and releases earthquakes also creates chemical environments where unfamiliar forms of metabolism can persist. For a creature such as Dulcibella camanchaca, the story becomes more evolutionary. Its discovery revealed a predatory amphipod unlike the scavenging forms commonly associated with hadal environments. Its specialized appendages allow it to seize prey rather than simply consume material that has fallen from above. Such a body is not an isolated curiosity. It represents a different ecological possibility emerging within a place where geography has limited contact with other deep ocean communities for immense spans of time. Isolation matters because evolution requires separation as well as inheritance. When populations remain divided, natural selection can push them along different paths. Small differences accumulate across generations, shaped by local food sources, pressures, predators, chemistry, and competition. Eventually, a population can become so distinct that its lineage belongs to a biological branch not represented elsewhere. In the Peru and Chile Trench, that process has unfolded under conditions that differ profoundly from those experienced by organisms nearer the surface. Even pressure becomes part of this biological history. At roughly 8,000 meters, about 26,000 feet, the force surrounding an organism reaches levels that would crush ordinary surface structures. Yet the animals living there possess tissues, membranes, proteins, and cellular processes adapted to function under that enormous pressure. Their survival is not a rejection of the environment, it is an accommodation to it, refined through generations. The result is a strange inversion of the usual image of hostile geology. Earthquakes, subduction, chemical reactions, and isolation are often described as destructive forces, but each can also create ecological opportunity. The falling food supplies a community. The altered minerals provide chemical energy. The separation allows lineages to diverge. The pressure filters life until only specialized forms remain. Nothing at the trench floor exists independently of the machinery above it. The desert, the mountains, the current, the earthquakes, the sediment, and the buried microbes belong to different parts of the same geological story. At the deepest edge of that system, life has answered with adaptation rather than absence, turning one of Earth's most severe environments into a place where evolution continues to write forms that may exist nowhere else, shaped by forces that operate together across ocean, continent, crust, and deep time. A single movement beneath the Pacific margin connects places that seem to belong to different worlds. The same descent of oceanic crust that disappears beneath South America has raised mountains, dried a desert, enriched a current, fractured the seafloor, and created habitats where evolution has taken paths found nowhere else. None of these outcomes exists separately from the others. They are different expressions of one process continuing beneath the continent. For roughly 200 million years, the Nazca Plate and its predecessors have been driven beneath South America. The boundary has migrated and changed through geological time, but subduction has remained a persistent force along this margin. As the oceanic plate descends, it transfers heat, water, sediment, and pressure into the deeper earth. Above it, the continental crust responds by shortening, thickening, uplifting, and deforming. The Andes are one expression of that response. Their immense chain stretches along the western edge of the continent, carrying the geological memory of countless episodes of uplift and deformation. Their existence changes atmospheric circulation, redirects moisture, and divides ecosystems that would otherwise share a different climate. Farther west, another consequence emerges from the same tectonic arrangement. The Atacama Desert occupies a landscape where rainfall has been suppressed to extraordinary levels. Moisture arriving from the Amazon encounters the Andes, while the cold waters of the Humboldt Current influence the atmosphere along the coast. Mountains and ocean interact through climate, and climate becomes part of the geological story. A tectonic boundary has therefore helped shape not only rock, but the distribution of water across an entire continent. The ocean responds in another way. Nutrients brought toward the surface by the Humboldt current support immense biological productivity. Microscopic organisms convert sunlight into organic matter. Fish consume them. Seabirds and marine mammals feed on those fish, and fisheries develop around the abundance. Much of that material eventually begins another journey downward, carrying biological carbon toward the deep ocean and the sediment of the trench. Far below, the same geological machinery creates a very different kind of abundance. Seep chemistry supports microbial communities without sunlight. Hadal sediments shelter organisms adapted to enormous pressure. Isolation allows populations to diverge, and the discovery of Dulcibella camanchaca shows that the trench can produce ecological roles unlike those documented in comparable environments. Life here is not merely enduring the tectonic system, it has become part of it. The geological process also stores another consequence in the fault itself. Friction locks portions of the plate boundary together while the plates continue their slow convergence. Strain accumulates through years, centuries, and longer intervals. Eventually, portions of that stored energy can be released through great earthquakes, displacing the seafloor and disturbing the ocean above it. The same boundary that nurtures life can also rearrange coastlines within moments. There is no contradiction to solve between these outcomes. The contradiction is the point. A process capable of producing destruction can also create habitats, climates, mountains, fisheries, and evolutionary opportunity. The Peru and Chile Trench is not one phenomenon with several unrelated side effects. It is one connected geological system whose consequences extend from the mantle to the atmosphere and from continental rock to living cells. The Nazca Plate continues descending at roughly 8 centimeters, about 3 inches each year. The movement is too slow for human senses to perceive, yet it remains active beneath everything above. Mountains continue to rise and erode. Sediment continues to accumulate. Carbon continues to move downward. Life continues to adapt. Stress continues to gather. Nothing in that sequence requires human attention to continue. The process began long before people could name it, and it will persist beyond the span of any individual life. The deepest paradox is therefore not that one geological boundary can create both beauty and catastrophe. It is that all of them are happening together, continuously, within the same moving earth. Depth has a way of becoming a shortcut for danger. The deeper something reaches, the more extreme it appears, and the mind naturally turns that measurement into a ranking. The deepest trench becomes the most threatening trench, the highest mountain becomes the most formidable, and the largest earthquake becomes the event that seems to define an entire region. Yet geology rarely follows such simple hierarchies. The Peru and Chile Trench offers a different measure. Its deepest point reaches more than 8 kilometers, about 5 miles, beneath the surface, placing it among the deepest places in the global ocean. But its importance does not come from winning a contest of depth. It comes from everything connected to that depth, from the moving plate beneath it to the continent above, and from the communities that have developed along the boundary between them. A measurement can describe where a structure is. It cannot, by itself, describe what that structure does. Here, the ocean floor forms the boundary between an oceanic plate and a continent whose western edge has been shaped by their interaction for immense spans of geological time. The consequences rise far beyond the trench itself. Fault motion can disturb the seafloor, displace seawater, and send energy toward distant coastlines. The same tectonic arrangement has contributed to the growth of the Andes, influenced regional climate, and helped create the conditions supporting extraordinary marine productivity along the adjacent coast. Even the biological world above and below carries the imprint of that connection. Nutrients brought toward the surface support immense food webs, while material descending through the water column becomes part of the sediment accumulating within the trench. Beneath that sediment, microorganisms can transform chemical compounds and alter the fate of carbon before some of it continues deeper into the earth. The boundary is therefore not an isolated depression. It is a meeting place between geology, oceanography, climate, chemistry, and life. Its seismic significance adds another dimension. Along parts of the margin, sections of the plate boundary can remain locked while the plates continue converging. Stress accumulates without announcing itself through any visible change at the surface. When rupture eventually occurs, the consequences can extend across hundreds of kilometers, about hundreds of miles, and through several interconnected systems at once. The 1960 Great Chilean Earthquake remains the largest earthquake ever instrumentally recorded, demonstrating how much energy this margin can release. That history changes the meaning of the trench's dimensions. A depth of 8 kilometers, about 5 miles, is an extraordinary physical measurement, but it says little about the distance an earthquake can affect, the coastlines a tsunami can reach, or the ecosystems that depend upon the surrounding ocean. A trench does not need to be the deepest place on Earth to become one of its most consequential geological structures. This is where measurement begins to fall short. Depth is precise, useful, and easy to compare. Reach is more difficult to place on a scale because it crosses boundaries between systems. A fault can influence an ocean can influence a climate can shape a desert, and the same geological boundary can create habitats for organisms adapted to conditions found nowhere else. The Mariana Trench tells us how far downward seawater can descend into the planet's deepest oceanic depression. The Peru and Chile Trench tells us something less convenient to measure. It shows how a structure beneath the sea can extend its influence upward into mountains, coastlines, weather, fisheries, carbon, and living communities. Depth records a dimension. Consequence records a connection. At great depth, stability can take a form that is difficult to see from the surface. The trench floor exists within a narrow physical envelope where temperature changes little, sunlight never arrives, and the pressure remains immense. Yet the most important feature of this environment may be its continuity. Conditions that would be extreme for a passing visitor can become ordinary when experienced across generations. Above this boundary, the surface of the planet has been repeatedly rearranged. Ice sheets have advanced and withdrawn, coastlines have migrated, ocean temperatures have shifted, and ecosystems have expanded, contracted, or disappeared. At the trench floor, those broad changes are filtered through layers of seawater and sediment. Organic particles continue descending from above, carrying energy into a world where the supply is slow but persistent. The result is not complete isolation, but a remarkably buffered habitat. For an organism living there, consistency changes the meaning of adaptation. Evolution does not stop when an environment becomes stable and populations continue to accumulate genetic differences. But natural selection has less reason to favor dramatic anatomical change when the conditions supporting survival remain familiar. A body plan that works efficiently can persist generation after generation, while changes elsewhere on Earth produce very different forms. This helps explain why deep marine environments can preserve ancient evolutionary features. A living organism is never literally frozen in time. Its genes continue to vary, its cells continue to function, and its population continues to evolve. What can persist is a recognizable structure, retained because it remains useful. In that sense, an ancient looking animal is not a survivor untouched by evolution. It is an organism whose environment may have placed relatively little pressure on its basic design. The distinction matters when scientists use the phrase living fossil. The term can suggest that an animal has remained unchanged for millions of years, but biology is rarely that simple. Modern descendants can resemble distant ancestors while still carrying substantial genetic and ecological differences. Their resemblance is evidence of long term anatomical persistence, not proof that evolution stopped. The trench floor offers an especially interesting setting for that persistence because its physical extremes are paired with geological continuity. The surrounding tectonic system can generate enormous earthquakes and reshape the continent above, while the deepest habitat itself may experience comparatively gradual environmental change between those rare disturbances. A creature does not need the landscape to be motionless for its local world to remain stable. It needs the conditions governing its daily existence to change slowly enough for its adaptations to remain effective. Sediment adds another layer to this continuity. Each particle arriving from the productive waters above becomes part of an accumulating record, burying older material beneath newer deposits. Microbes living within those layers can continue transforming carbon and other compounds long after the original organic matter disappeared from the surface. The biological activity, therefore, extends downward through time as well as through space. There is something especially fitting in this arrangement. The same tectonic boundary that produces sudden instability on a continental scale can maintain a deep environment where biological change unfolds under remarkably persistent conditions. Catastrophe and continuity are not opposites here. They occupy different scales of the same system. At the surface, the trench belongs to a planet in motion. Far below, life has found a narrower rhythm, shaped by pressure, chemistry, sediment, and an enduring supply of material from above. If ancient forms have persisted there, their survival would not mean that the trench stopped changing. It would mean that, within one of Earth's most restless geological structures, some of the smallest lives found a world that changed slowly enough for old solutions to remain useful. The ocean contains more than 360 million square miles of surface, and its average depth is roughly 3,700 meters, about 12,100 feet. Its total volume is measured in hundreds of millions of cubic miles. Such numbers describe an immense physical space, yet they remain difficult for the human mind to hold as lived experience. Within that vastness, the Mariana Trench carries the measurement that naturally captures attention. Challenger Deep descends nearly 11,000 meters, about 36,000 feet, making it the deepest known point in the ocean. Crude explorers have descended there, instruments have reached its floor, and generations of scientists have used it as a reference for the limits of oceanic depth. It is a remarkable place, and its record is worth preserving, but depth alone does not explain consequence. The earthquake that struck Chile in 1960 was not devastating because the fault descended farther beneath the ocean than another fault. Its reach came from the length of the rupture, the convergence of tectonic plates, the displacement of the seafloor, and the enormous volume of water connected to the disturbance. The resulting tsunami crossed the Pacific, reaching Japan roughly 22 hours after the earthquake began. A disturbance born beside one continent became a physical event felt across an entire ocean. That difference changes the meaning of a trench. A geological structure becomes consequential when its influence escapes its immediate surroundings. Along the Peru and Chile margin, the boundary between the Nazca Plate and South America links the deep ocean to the Andes, the coastal climate, the Humboldt Current, and the ecosystems supported by its nutrient-rich waters. Sediment descending into the trench becomes part of a much older planetary exchange involving carbon, minerals, water, and life. Beneath the floor, microorganisms participate in chemical processes that can alter how some of that carbon is stored before deeper burial. Far above, the same tectonic arrangement has helped produce a continental mountain system and contributed to the aridity of the Atacama Desert. Along the coast, upwelling sustains one of the most productive marine environments on Earth. Beneath the surface, the locked fault continues accumulating strain between major ruptures. Deeper still, organisms have adapted to pressure, limited energy, and the chemistry of sediments that have gathered over immense spans of time. The same principle applies to biological discovery. An organism found at extreme depth may be scientifically valuable because of where it lives, but the deeper story lies in the network of conditions that made its existence possible. Food arriving from productive waters, sediment accumulating over time, chemical reactions within buried layers, and tectonic isolation can all become part of one ecological history. The depth provides the setting. The surrounding system provides the meaning. None of these consequences can be read from the trench's depth alone. The deepest point in the ocean is a precise measurement, but precision does not guarantee relevance. A ruler can tell us how far downward a place extends. It cannot tell us how much coastline depends upon its stability, how far a tsunami may travel, how many ecosystems are connected to its circulation, or how many generations of life can adapt within its sediments. That is why the Peru and Chile Trench changes the way the ocean's extremes can be understood. Its significance is not concentrated at the lowest point. It is distributed outward through the continent, the atmosphere, the surface ocean, the seafloor, and the living systems between them. The trench matters because it is connected. Depth makes a record. Connection makes a consequence.